Hey, alright, welcome back. You liked that part 1, huh? I guess you must be to be here for part 2 after all that. So, I'll give you a brief recap. A couple episodes ago we had a conversation about open world games, supposed critical fatigue, the things that make up the formula that people are supposedly fatigued with, and from there we talked about the eternal cycle in art, the relationship between art itself, criticism, originality, and popular reception. And we framed that conversation with 2 big questions: whether or not there was an X factor in the popular reception of a work, and whether or not originality increases the inherent value of a work. And after taking a brief joyride through a bunch of music and a bunch of games, I gave you my perspective. No popular reception X factor, but there is one in critical reception, which is originality, which does increase the inherent value of a work, so long as that doesn't interfere with good artistic taste, which it did in serialism, which is why we talked about that. Anyway. So we've talked a lot about the what and the how, and now we're going to get a little bit more into the why. Let's take a look at what happens when you have no originality, with what I like to call pop games. IGN posted an article a little while ago, the title of which was something like "Long Average Games Have Value Too," and there was a picture of Days Gone on the cover of it, which has sort of become the poster child for these conversations, but I'm almost positive that they posted the article to coincide with the release of Forspoken, which, for the record, I've really been enjoying. You say what you want about IGN, but they're absolutely right about this.
Everybody's gone to bed and sleep and we're up all night instead. Games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present Soliloquies. Everybody's gone to bed and sleep and we're up all night instead. Games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present Soliloquies.
Pop games are the checklist games. The ones that do everything you expect. They make a ton of money, they get 6s, 7s, or 8s from reviewers, and some of them get frequent installments. Most of these games don't have an original concept anywhere in their 100-hour runtimes, and because of that, they face scrutiny from both critical and popular circles. But much like pop music, even with criticism from both sides, millions of people still really enjoy them. And consider this. Do developers really owe it to us to at least try to push the medium every time? Do they have some kind of obligation as creators to attempt something revolutionary? Some say yes, because if we as patrons are shelling hundreds of our hard-earned dollars a year for a product, it ought to be a good one. Some say no, because that transaction is completely optional and entertainment is subjective. But either way, consumers will consume. If pop games are what's available, many gamers would rather play that than nothing. And just like pop music, the onus for change isn't on the consumers who enjoy the product, it's on the industry that churns it out.
We all know gamers who complain about the Call of Duties and Assassin's Creeds of the world, who'd prefer that another game just never see the light of day. But to me, suggesting that pop games should just simultaneously expire is akin to suggesting that all pop musicians should one day just cold turkey stop making music. Some of y'all would like that, I bet, but the fact is billions of people wouldn't. Popular art, which is again a term that I hate, will always change naturally and according to the trends of time. From current conventions will inevitably come folks who will play with what's been done, thereby inventing new ways to do it. But again, we've already spent so much time talking about the how, and now we're going to talk about the why.
So as we established, eventually that tasty vanilla ice cream, when you eat enough of it, is going to make you sick. The fulcrum between familiarity and novelty will eventually shift, it always happens. But that tipping point is extraordinarily different depending on the series, and what really keyed me into that was Far Cry 6. I haven't played this one, but I've played all the others since 2, and a lot of fans have been giving the series shit for a while on the grounds that several of the entries are simply reskins of one another. Now, without getting too into the technical ways that's true, like New Dawn literally just using part of the map of 5, The complaints really started with 4. I loved Far Cry 4. Similar to 3 in terms of gameplay, yeah, but I thought it was a great improvement on a great game. Even so, many people called it the same game. But a lot of sequels that I could name that play similarly to their predecessors, off the top of my head, Assassin's Creed 2, Ratchet & Clank 2, or Rift Apart for that matter, Mario Galaxy 2, any of the Monster Hunter games from the 4 Generations era, are just as beloved, if not more so, than their predecessors.
So here's our third big question, and I'm going to pose it very simply, answer it very quickly, and explain it in great detail. What is the difference? The answer? Execution. Ratchet & Clank comes out with a game that introduces new locations and new weapons over mostly the same gameplay and is lauded every time. Far Cry does the same thing and gets panned. And a lot of you familiar with both franchises are going, well, that's a false equivalency, it's not the same thing, it's more complex than that, and you're right. And now we're going to talk about why you're right.
When we look at the historical reception of games, if there's one thing that's for certain, it's that the amount of new something has to have to succeed is less a factor than the quality and creativity of the new material presented, even if the overall product is very familiar. Let's start with an example I'm sure y'all are all familiar with. Nintendo. When it comes to video games, fun supersedes all. All fun is subjective, but some fun is so universal that it's almost just factually fun, and Nintendo has been the master of almost factually fun for 40 years. Those of you who've been gaming for a while, you know that lots of Nintendo franchises have maintained extremely similar premises over the years. But it's in the execution, creativity, and overall fun factor that they're able to do that and still create these fresh and exciting experiences for the gamer. Nintendo proves that you can have both novelty and familiarity. Here's another example which I think is almost more applicable: Grand Theft Auto. There have been upgrades to the graphics and the physics engine, but those games really haven't been that different since San Andreas. You drive, you fly, you boat, you swim, you run, you shoot, you do missions, you explore the world. The things that make people like those games and view them as original and creative are the real-life simulation aspects, the characters, and the mission structuring, not because they're super different from each other. Yeah, GTA 4 added the cell phone and GTA 5 added character switching, but past that, the games play very similarly. But nobody thinks that's a bad thing because even operating within largely the same gameplay system, the games are so great, we don't really care. Another example, Ratchet & Clank. Those of you who've been playing for a while know that the core gameplay of the series hasn't changed at all since the PS2. There were some experiments with the formula here and there, but in fact, with the absence of things like dogfights and racing segments, the gameplay is actually more one-note now than it used to be. Yet, it's still going strong, still puts up great numbers, it's still beloved. How is this possible? Well, look at the variety of locales you visit. Look at the wide array of crazy, imaginative aliens you encounter. Look at the sheer absurdity and breadth of wacky weapons. And look at the overall vibrant, cartoonish color palette and presentation. These games are allowed to stay the same.
You are very strange, Ratchet.
I've been told that a time or two.
From Software. I've expressed a few strong opinions about these games. I'm gonna express more in the future. But we can all agree that from Demon's Souls to Elden Ring, they've mostly played the same. Yet, Elden Ring got rave reviews. Why didn't it feel stale? Locales, weapons, enemy variety, level design, imagination. You seeing the pattern here yet? Now, let's compare all those examples to Far Cry. Without a doubt, Far Cry 3 is the game most fondly remembered, and for good reason. It combines stealth, survival, action, open-world exploration, psychedelic storytelling, and first-person shooting into an experience that, at the time, was revolutionary. So Ubisoft says, okay, this worked, so let's do it again, but with more. Sound strategy. Far Cry 4 comes out. Rather than a tropical island, this one's set in a completely opposite climate in the mountains. Additions included flying vehicles, new animals, and rideable, violent elephants, as well as branching choice-based gameplay where the missions and story change depending on your decisions.
And if I had a choice between Darpan and the intelligence, I choose the intel.
But that wasn't new enough for most people, and After that, it kind of just kept going downhill.
You know, this doesn't work so much for books or movies, but where games are concerned, doing what worked for the first one, except better and with more content, is usually a recipe for success. You know, take Super Mario Galaxy 2 here. It didn't reinvent the wheel, still a beloved game, but that didn't work for Far Cry and many series like it. Now we're hitting on the answer to our third big question, and get ready, I'm going to hit you with the big mix-up here. Our fourth question isn't going to be a question at all, but it's actually going to be the answer to our third question. I argue that certain types of games don't lend themselves to being very original.
It's common knowledge that when it comes to uninspired checklist-type open-world content, Ubisoft is everyone's favorite company to hate on. But that doesn't stop millions of gamers, including me, from enjoying Far Cry or Assassin's Creed. And like I said last episode, people love Ghost even with its repetitive open world. And like I said this episode, I love Forspoken even with its repetitive open world. And here's where we've got this cool full circle moment. We're talking about all of this because of supposed fatigue of open world games. We came to the conclusion that gamers aren't tired of open worlds themselves, but of their stereotypical hallmarks. We expanded on that and said that a game's value as the sum of its parts, its story, gameplay, soundtrack, could outweigh a lack of originality with an abundance of personality. Now, expanding on that, I make the point that certain types of games have a harder time creating a personality for themselves. Now, I'm not making this point to make excuses for repetitive content, but I do think it's worth considering that it's objectively harder to make certain genres feel fresh. And what that boils down to for me is how many parameters the genre is defined by.
So here's my big point. The more numerous the qualifiers of a genre, the harder it is to make it feel unique. The more things something is, the harder it is for it to be special. And the apex of limiting parameters has to be the modern FIFA or Madden game. Now, people historically love things that practice deliberate simplicity. I mean, look at how many weird little indie games are just so much their own thing because they're so singularly focused. But we've talked so much about instances where complexity hurts creativity, so let's actually talk about the inverse for a second. When people are so critical of complexity that it hurts creativity.
Let me explain what I mean. Platformers, for example, are infinitely and easily variable because the only thing that even defines that genre is that your challenges are jumping based. But other than that, you can do literally anything. You can have a 3D platformer, a puzzle platformer, a Metroidvania, a shooter platformer, whatever the hell Celeste is, whatever the hell Ghost Runner is. I mean, there's a million platformers out there and they're all so different because the thing that makes that genre what it is so non-restrictive. On the other hand, look at your typical first-person shooter, the FPS. You have to be in first person, your main weapon must be ranged, the focal point of the game must be shooting at things. I mean, that's 3 major rules already. And if jumping is the core of platformers, the core of the shooter, shooting, isn't gonna feel all that different from game to game. Counter-argument is that weapon variety circumvents that, but aside from fantasy or sci-fi settings where new weapons can be made up, most shooters will have the same array of things: an SMG, sniper, shotgun, pistol, RPG, grenade launcher, etc. I think that's why some gamers say all militaristic FPS games are the same. I lack extensive first-hand knowledge, I don't play COD or Battlefield, and it'd be hypocritical for me to make big grand assertions about games I've never even played, but I won't deny that they probably are similar. But let's look harder at why. Is it because of developer laziness, lack of creativity, publisher greediness? In some cases, yes, absolutely. But when you make your game a realistic first-person shooter set in a real-life conflict, how creative can you even really be? The gaming space is inherently a fantasy one for a reason. Can you imagine if all our works of fiction in books, in movies, in comics, and TV shows, and yes, in games, limited themselves to the real world? Can you imagine how boring the stories would be by now?
Here we go!
And the more I think about it, that's probably why series like Madden and FIFA and 2K get similar complaints. It's a sport. Set in the real world too, not like Rocket League or ARMS. You want to talk about genre restrictions? Sports have massive, complex lists of exactly how they're supposed to be played. I don't think it's possible to make a video game with stricter parameters than that. They're based on activities that have been played roughly the same way for decades. What could possibly be that different? Going back to music again, let's look at the jazz world this time. Jazz is commonly recognized as a singular genre, but when you get into it, you'll see that it's comprised of approximately 1,000 subgenres, and the proponents of each often hated each other with a passion. Many genres have subgenres, the purpose of which are to further narrow down sounds within vast and therefore unhelpful genre headings.
Someone says to me that they want to talk about jazz. I might say to them, okay, well, what do you want to talk about? You want to talk about Dixieland, boogie woogie, the blues, swing, bebop, hard bop, hot jazz, cool jazz, sweet jazz, soul jazz, smooth jazz, symphonic jazz, fusion? There's so many different styles, all operating under the umbrella heading of jazz. But because of the uniqueness of those specific substyles, they're all completely distinct and identifiable from one another. And we're talking about jazz right now, but this holds true with any genre. Think about rock, you know? Think about how different Chuck Berry sounds from Meshuggah or Seven Dust or System of a Down or Radiohead or the Beatles, even though they're all operating under the head of rock or metal. So sometimes substyles can be a good thing. Parameters can be a good thing. They can help you more easily artistically focus what you want to do within an incredibly broad scope of content. But sometimes limitations are still limitations.
Now, let's look at the other side, when limitations hinder rather than help. In the jazz world, there was a schism in the 60s when there was this influx of radically new approaches to the music, and many people who liked the old approaches discounted this new music from actually being jazz at all. There's a whole complex discussion around that because some of those folks also didn't like the word jazz itself. I'm oversimplifying to be concise, but basically a new school came around, the old school said no, which is a story that's been repeating itself since art first started and a story we've probably all seen somewhere. But the difference here is that this new school, unlike cool and hard and bebop and big band and New York before it, never fully came into vogue. It never became the main driving force of the genre. Does that sound familiar? Then the 70s rolled around. Rock was in full swing and was quickly taking over as the new most popular music in America. And in the spirit of the freedom of expression the previous decade had championed, some jazz musicians responded to this by merging their craft with rock and roll. There were varying degrees of success, which I think is less because it couldn't be done and more because some musicians weren't ready to do it. But again, that's another conversation. Ready or not though, the players making fusion music, as it was called, had started a movement that some folks born in the 80s and 90s actually embraced because they had grown up listening to genre bending. Music without limits. Enter the limiter.
Understand that right now, we're talking about something that I feel very strongly about. And eventually, there probably will be a video or two just on this topic, but for now, we're going to keep things relatively simple. So, in music, whenever there is a movement, there's inevitably going to be a counter movement, and in the late 20th century, Wynton Marsalis, who led this group of people we usually call traditionalists or young lions, right? Their goal was to create a central definition of jazz practice that new players could use as a historical and practical starting point to get into the music. And there is nothing wrong with that. It's great that they did that. It's pedagogically extremely important that they did that. But where they fucked up was in the active dismissal and resentment of more outside forms of the music. The Ken Burns documentary, which you've almost certainly seen some of at some point, and was essential to dispensing jazz knowledge to the average American, was a massive culprit in this. And as a student of jazz, when I got to grad school, I had to really dig to find the information that I wanted to find. And that's a damn shame that they would omit a few decades of the music like that, because a lot of my favorite exponents of the music come from that era, and a lot of my current favorites grew up listening to that music, like I mentioned earlier. I say all this to say that yes, it is the boundaries that let us appreciate things, but boundaries are still limitations. And while limitations aren't necessarily a bad thing, when they intentionally stifle ingenuity, they absolutely can be.
So let's start tying everything we've talked about together. In art history, we talk about this thing called pluralism, which is an explosion of lots of different substyles within a new medium that's all but guaranteed to happen after a while. Because humans, especially creative humans, like to make things their own, and gaming is no different. Nowadays, genre bending is popular in games, and part of that is because when you combine two opposing things, with colors, with food, with movies, whatever, you get something new and exciting. And so quite often, when you want an FPS to have a distinct personality, you hybridize it with another genre. Exhibits A and B, Borderlands and BioShock, two of the most acclaimed shooter franchises of all time, hybridize FPS with strategy, suspense, survival horror, and RPG elements. And lots of people love those games because they feel fresh, but part of that freshness is because of that genre blending. Of course, it's possible to make a shooter feel unique without wandering too far outside the genre, a la New Doom, but that's such a one-of-a-kind example that it almost drives the point home even more. So given that hybridization is an easy way to make a work fresh, it's worth considering if that's why, as game history has gone on, all these big games have gradually evolved to try to be everything at once. At one point in history, throwing all these game mechanics together was a recipe for success, but it's so commonplace now that it's typical. So I think, or at least I hope, that in the future, we'll see more games practicing not necessarily complete simplicity, but smaller combinations of different games. Take Fallen Order, which is this neat blend of modern swordplay like you'd see in Sekiro or Ghost, Souls-like progression and checkpoint system, and gameplay, traversal, and exploration mechanics that remind me most of Metroid Prime or Prince of Persia. The result is a game that clearly took cues from several places, making for a varied experience, but it's so much its own thing. Some of you might not like Forspoken's world or its dialogue, which I still opine is a silly reason not to like a game, but its gameplay, which is this combination of Infamous and Final Fantasies 13 and 15, is very much its own, and people almost universally agree that this element of the game, at least, is pretty awesome. And with each passing year, the phenomenon of pluralism in games grows. Obviously, we've got way more types of games on the market than 30 years ago, because designers keep doing new and exciting things. Games, like all art, don't exist in a bubble. All creatives see what other creatives do and then say, hey, that's really cool, take some inspiration and spin it into something of their own. We'll never run out of new ideas for art. The permutations of old and new ideas are literally infinite. Of course, this capacity for limitless uniqueness in art puts a much tougher eye on existent styles, especially popular ones. But think of it this way. Jazz musicians of the 50s and 60s were compelled to change in the 70s to compete with rock, but many refused to compromise what they felt was their integrity, and now we've got bebop, fusion, and rock coexisting today. And when we look at games, we can see that preservation of older styles is a really popular thing. Remember, not too long ago, people complained about games being too linear, and now they complain about them being too open. Art is a pendulum. 20 years from now, who knows? The open world might be long dead, replaced by the next big thing, and someone will make a checklist game that we consider boring by today's standards, and people will play it and go, hey, I remember these, how retro and quaint, and it'll put up 10s across the board. So to bring it all the way back to the original point, the traditional open world experience. Does it need to die? I say, no, it doesn't. It's a natural part of the gaming landscape. It came about through natural artistic trends, and like most art, it's experiencing its pop phase right now that'll come to an end if and when it should. Originality and good artistic taste, like they always do, will prevail and pull the landscape in a different direction, and the open world will remain a distinct period in game history that some people will have a soft spot for. And in this way, the critics and the gamers are both essential parts of the dialectical. One to encourage innovation, one to endure it. One to demand originality, and one to discern whether it's worth it. one to push the history, one to preserve it.
Not much more to say than that, honestly. So, this concludes my big 2, technically 3 episode arc about the art criticism dialectical as we see it in games and music. And if you sat through the whole thing, congratulations and thank you for sticking with it. If you got any kind of enjoyment out of it, or you found it fun or thought-provoking or interesting in any way, maybe consider showing this video to somebody else that you think would. The more viewers I have, the easier it is for me to do these things. Tune in next time for something a little bit simpler. See ya.